But if, as has been asserted for the past 40 years, these documents were not prepared as a tool to decipher the papyri, what then was their purpose? I confess that my original thesis was consistent with Professor Hugh Nibley's idea that the alphabet and grammar represent the product of an effort on the part of its authors to reverse engineer the Egyptian scrolls by using the pre-existing English text of the Book of Abraham as a primer. In other words, they had in their hands what they believed was an English translation of at least a portion of the scrolls they had purchased, and therefore they logically concluded that they could replicate Champollion's approach to the Rosetta Stone. You'll recall that Champollion used the Greek text on the Rosetta Stone as a primer to decipher the corresponding hieroglyphic Egyptian text. I surmise that William Phelps, Joseph Smith, and Oliver Cowdery set out to do something similar with the previously received text of the Book of Abraham. However, as my studies of the alphabet and grammar materials progressed, I discovered evidence that effectively disproved such a notion. I discovered that several of the explanations in the alphabet and grammar documents were dependent not on text from the Book of Abraham, but rather on very recognizable passages from others of Joseph Smith's prior revelations, most prominently sections 76 and 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants. We could spend an hour discussing nothing but the dependencies on material not found in the Book of Abraham, but we will focus on just one of the impressive examples. Character 46 makes clear reference to the celestial kingdom where God resides. Character 47 merely references another kingdom governed by different laws, and as such constitutes nothing more than a placeholder for what we shall see must be the terrestrial kingdom. Character 48, however, was provided with expansions beyond another kingdom governed by different laws, explanations that clearly indicate its relationship to specific language employed in section 76 to describe the telestial kingdom. There are three components attested. Subjects of this kingdom suffer the wrath of God until some future period, or in the words of section 76, until the fullness of times. Next, and this is the most striking of the correspondences, we read that the inhabitants of this kingdom differ one from another in glory, which is precisely what we read in section 76. As one star differs from another star in glory, even so differs one from another in the telestial world. Finally, we read that in this kingdom, the subjects behold not the face of God, for where God and Christ dwell, they cannot come worlds without end. Next is character 49, which very succinctly references the language from section 88 that describes a kingdom which is not a kingdom of glory. Thus we see, in the explanations given to four successive characters from the alphabet and grammar, very particular references to specific passages from those two giants of Joseph Smith's previously received revelations, sections 76 and 88. Right in order, this so-called grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language is making reference to the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial kingdoms, followed immediately by the kingdom which is not a kingdom of glory. I went on to identify several additional references that are clearly dependent on other passages from the Doctrine and Covenants. I confess I was rather befuddled by this finding, and it took me several days of contemplation before I began to appreciate its import and its implications. First of all, I came to see that my initial hypothesis could not possibly be true. To the extent this lexicon was built partially on texts that have no relationship to the Egyptian papyri, texts that were written not in Egyptian at all, but in English, then the alphabet and grammar simply could not have been intended as a tool to decipher the papyri. Indeed, the more I considered the evidence in this new light, the more I came to believe that these men were not focused on translating the Egyptian papyri at all. One of the keys to this conclusion was my discovery that, of the 69 characters to which explanations were assigned, most of them are not even Egyptian and do not appear on the papyri. Let me repeat. Most of the characters explained in the Egyptian alphabet documents are not Egyptian, and do not appear on the Egyptian papyri in question. A few of the characters are Egyptian and can be found on the papyri, but not in any one place and not in any order and not with any discernible relationships. They appear to have been selected arbitrarily. Of the 69 characters given explanations, some of them are clearly invented. Some are composites. In other words, they are formed by combining two or more previously used characters. And, much to my surprise, I discovered that several of the characters can be traced to ciphers used by the Knights Templar and the Freemasons. So let's pause a minute to review the important elements of evidence at this point in the investigation. First of all, we're dealing with a document whose text is dependent on and informed by the Book of Abraham, as well as others of Joseph Smith's previously received revelations. It employs a mixture of some Egyptian characters, some apparently invented characters, and other characters selected from centuries-old ciphers. The next clue in our mystery comes in the form of what may well be the most instructive 2 pages of the entire collection of documents known as the Kirtland Egyptian Papers, the Egyptian Counting Document. Why is this document so instructive? Because it, more clearly than all the others, demonstrates the fundamental purpose of the project of which it is an integral part. As I mentioned earlier, the Egyptian Counting Document lists a series of characters with names and English explanations. What is most interesting, however, is that the characters in the Egyptian Counting Document are very obviously not Egyptian. They have no relationship whatsoever to the papyri. The character representing 1 appears to be a minor variation of the standard Arabic numeral for 1. 2 is also somewhat similar to the Arabic numeral. 3 is a variation of 2. 4 is Arabic. 5 is Arabic. Here's where it gets really curious. 6 is identical to the Sanskrit character for the number 6. In a table of Knights Templar ciphers I discovered, one of the ciphers was based on Sanskrit characters. 7 is Arabic. 8 is Arabic. 9 is identical to the Sanskrit character for 9. And finally, 10 appears to be a minor variation of the Arabic. As I pondered the ramifications of these facts, the conclusion became obvious to me. What we have here is a tool not intended to decipher Egyptian, but rather one intended to encipher the descriptive English text of the cardinal numbers. It constitutes a specimen of what is known in cryptography as a cipher key. The characters which are not Egyptian and which do not come from the papyri are intended to be a cipher representing the English words in the explanations column. Thus, this character means 6. Similarly, this pair of characters means 10 and 1 are 11. And these 3 characters mean twice 10 and 1 are 21. So why is this document entitled Egyptian Counting? There is absolutely nothing Egyptian about it. Nothing at all. Why then did they call it Egyptian? Well, the answer to that question is, in my judgment, the key to understanding the underlying motivations and design of both the Egyptian Counting Document and the Egyptian alphabet and grammar. Simply put, the evidence strongly suggests that these documents were never designed as a tool to translate the Book of Abraham. Joseph Smith did that by revelation. Rather, the alphabet, grammar, and counting documents appear to have been intended to render the English text of the prophet's revelations into some kind of cipher that these men apparently believed to be typical of language as practiced by the ancients. Not that they would have called it a cipher by any means. No, I believe the term they would have used to describe what they were doing is translation. Not of Egyptian papyri, mind you, but of already written English texts into a set of characters of their own selection and invention. Nevertheless, these tables they produced in the process of their translation project have the effective function of a cipher key. What is a cipher key? The simplest answer to that question can be provided by briefly examining the function of the Masonic cipher. Also called the Rosicrucian cipher, this cipher dates back to the late 17th century and is a simple substitution cipher which exchanges letters for symbols. In cryptography, a substitution cipher is a method of encryption by which units of plain text are replaced with cipher text according to a regular system. The receiver deciphers the text by performing an inverse substitution by aid of a cipher key. The Masonic cipher is based on fragments of 4 separate geometric grids, which form 26 individual spaces in which the letters of the English alphabet are placed. Here I have randomly placed the 26 letters of the alphabet in the 26 compartments of the grid. Here we see how the individual grid fragments form distinct symbols, juxtaposed with the substitution character from the key. The first grid of the key comprises 9 cipher characters and 9 substitution characters. In our presently defined key, we see the cipher characters and the letter of the alphabet they represent. First, the letter A, the letter C, the letter E, G, and I. The second grid of the key also comprises 9 cipher characters and 9 substitution characters. Here we see the cipher characters and the letter they represent. Finally, the last 2 grids comprise a total of 8 cipher characters and 8 substitution characters for a total of 26 individual grid fragments. You see, the meaning of the cipher characters is arbitrary, depending on the placement of the substitution values. The grids constitute a generic template. The cipher characters themselves are generic symbols. Their meaning is assigned at the time the template is populated. Using this cipher key definition, the words Masonic cipher would be rendered as such in cipher characters. This then is how a basic cipher key functions. In the Egyptian counting document, the various elements of a cipher key are clearly attested. The character column contains the cipher value. The English explanation column contains the substitution value for the cipher character. But what was the underlying motivation of these men? What is the purpose of this cipher? Remember, all of this was going on at the same time the Doctrine and Covenants was being prepared for publication. Several of these revelations were considered so sensitive in nature that they had begun to employ coded names to hide the identities of people and places. There is a substantial body of historical evidence demonstrating this desire to encipher information such that it was only understandable to those who possessed the key to the encrypted data. In addition to encryption, there were other motivations driving this Egyptian alphabet project, specifically an interest that precedes by many years their encounter with Egyptian papyri in July of 1835. This interest was undoubtedly influenced by a larger body of European philosophical thought dating back to at least the 17th century, literature that speculated concerning the nature of the language of the ancients. William Phelps was extremely interested in the notion of something he termed pure language. His interest was contagious, and both Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery manifest a similar longing for what they imagined was the purity of language as delivered by God to Adam in the Garden of Eden. They spoke and wrote frequently concerning their belief that human language had been corrupted through the years, the confounding of the languages at the Tower of Babel being merely the beginning of the deviation from the original purity of the primordial Adamic tongue. In the mind of Phelps and the others, Egyptian was apparently believed to have somehow avoided the confounding of the languages at the Tower of Babel. Egyptian, therefore, became a term that, for them, was synonymous with pure language. Thus, they see no contradiction in titling as Egyptian counting a document that contains not a single element that is Egyptian. Nor did they perceive any contradiction in titling the other documents Egyptian alphabet and grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, notwithstanding the fact that most of the characters they translate are not Egyptian, nor are the source texts themselves. Again, the evidence strongly suggests that the alphabet and grammar was never intended nor designed to decipher anything. Quite to the contrary, it was a short-lived attempt to construct an ideographic cipher and lexicon whereby those who produced it took selections of Joseph Smith's body of revelatory texts written in English and assigned to them simple character values. In their minds, the capacity of a single character to represent a word or a sentence or even an entire paragraph of over 100 words was typical of what they believed to have been the pure language of the ancients. Don't misunderstand. I have encountered no evidence to date that they believed they were actually restoring the language of Adam, although it is possible they believed that some of the characters they produced had come to them through inspiration. No, it appears they were merely producing their own rendition of what they believed pure language would be like. The point is that deciphering Egyptian scrolls was not their purpose. The kind of translation they were attempting ran in the other direction. Indeed, William Phelps had already executed the first example of a practical attempt to do just that several weeks before Michael Chandler and his Egyptian papyri ever rolled into Kirtland, Ohio. In this letter to his wife Sally, written more than a month before Chandler and his mummies turned up in Kirtland, Phelps includes an extract from the earliest known example of his encryption template, his cipher key. He entitled it appropriately, A Specimen of Some of the Pure Language. Here we see a table almost identical in format to those used in the alphabet and grammar. In the left-hand column are written 6 characters, followed by a column of sounds and English explanations that derive from elements of Joseph Smith's previously received revelations. Another intriguing aspect of this table is that 3 of the characters are identical to characters used in the Masonic Cipher. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because a little less than 2 months later, Phelps reuses these same 6 characters in the Egyptian alphabet documents. Not only that, but he assigns to these 6 previously used cipher characters 6 new sounds and 6 completely new explanations. In this new cipher key, this new specimen of some of the pure language, the explanations assigned to these manifestly generic characters are related to different previously received revelations, primarily the recently revealed Book of Abraham. The evidence is abundant and compelling. These pure language tables appear to be designed to function as a kind of ideographic cipher and lexicon. Obviously, Phelps introduced dozens more characters when he built the pure language cipher table for the Egyptian alphabet. But the presence of these 6 characters from his earlier specimen confirms the evidence already adduced that a cipher key is precisely what these documents are designed to be. They would no doubt have called it a translation key or something like that. In any case, its function is identical to a typical substitution cipher key. We see the exact same characters in exactly the same order, yet with different sounds and different explanations. But the underlying purpose is the same: to serve as a type of pure language cipher. In fact, a close examination of the characters employed in the Egyptian alphabet reveals that no fewer than 7 of the characters are derived straight from the Masonic cipher, underscoring the common functions of the two things. I have now identified no fewer than 4 separate pure language cipher keys, as well as another one that is referenced but now lost. The earliest example is found in the letter from Phelps to his wife in May 1835. The next example is the Egyptian counting document, where a new set of invented characters are the cipher, and English words that spell out the corresponding numbers are the substitution value. The third example is the Egyptian alphabet and grammar. Some of the same characters from the Phelps letter are employed as ciphers in the key, but with different sounds and explanations. In fact, if we examine closely the way Phelps laid out his Egyptian alphabet document, we can see that he actually provided a column for a single letter substitution value as well. The Phelps Egyptian alphabet document is the only one that has such a column headed letter, and it only contains such a column on the first page, after which Phelps dispensed with it altogether. However, we can see what he initially set out to do. He wrote a letter A in the first line of the column, only to partially erase it and then overwrite an X in its place. Here I have highlighted in red the partially erased and then overwritten letter A, again without the red highlighting. After erasing the A and putting an X in its place, Phelps then makes an X on the next two lines, seemingly to emphasize the fact that a single letter substitution was not to be a part of this particular cipher key. Even so, the presence of this letter substitution column confirms the function of this document as a cipher key. He's using what amounts to a generic template. But you see, the substitution values for this cipher key are not going to be single letters, but rather entire words or even sentences and paragraphs. The fourth example of a pure language cipher key is the Abraham manuscripts authored by Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish. Just as the Egyptian alphabet cipher key divided the characters into parts and the explanations into degrees, so also the first line of these two manuscripts tells us that the characters that follow are designated as being from the second part of this particular cipher key, and their accompanying explanations are designated as being in the fifth degree. Thus, the first cipher character has a substitution value of, I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the fathers concerning the seed. And the second cipher character has a substitution value of, my fathers having turned from their righteousness and from the holy commandments which the Lord their God had given unto them, unto the worshiping of the gods of the heathens. And it goes on with individual characters drawn from the papyri in the fashion John Gee has described, representing entire paragraphs from the text of the book of Abraham. Well, there is so much more, but the time is exhausted. I have had to leave so much out that I would have preferred to include. I would have liked, for example, to spend at least half an hour detailing the evidence supporting the conclusion that it was William Phelps who was the dominant and driving force behind this entire project. But that will have to await another day. At the start of my presentation today, I cited this entry in the history of the church. In light of the evidence and arguments I have just presented, I want to revisit this sentence and see if perhaps we can now view it a bit differently. We'll divide it into two parts. The first part reads, the remainder of the month I was continually engaged in translating an alphabet to the book of Abraham. Note well the phrasing. Engaged in translating an alphabet to the book of Abraham. It refers to the book of Abraham as a fait accompli, and so it was, as the textual evidence persuasively demonstrates. They began the so-called Egyptian alphabet project focused on the previously received text of the first 3 chapters of the book of Abraham, then later expanded their focus to others of Joseph Smith's revelations. They were at least partially motivated by the prevailing atmosphere in Kirtland circa 1835, when the need was felt to encrypt sensitive information from Joseph Smith's revelations. In addition, there is a considerable body of historical evidence suggesting their fascination with the notion of a pure language of the ancients. To be sure, in the course of their cipher project, they employed the term Egyptian. But the text-critical evidence is conclusive on this point. Egyptian simply cannot mean for them, in the context of this project, what we have always believed it to mean. Only when we come to see that in their minds, Egyptian was synonymous with pure language, can we begin to understand how they could entitle as Egyptian counting a document that contains not a single Egyptian element whatsoever. Returning to the journal entry, we read that they were also engaged in arranging a grammar of the Egyptian language as practiced by the ancients. The textual evidence strongly affirms that this cannot mean the Egyptian language as practiced by the Egyptians. No, their focus is much wider than that and goes back before Babel, driven by their notions of what constituted the pure language of the antediluvian fathers. I believe these are the ancients to whom reference is made in this brief description of their activities in the summer of 1835. Even so, regardless of what their underlying purpose was in producing these materials, the essential element of understanding concerning the Kirtland Egyptian papers is that they are dependent on the Book of Abraham and not the other way around. Contrary to what has been commonly believed for the past 40 years, the evidence strongly suggests that nothing in the collection of documents known as the Kirtland Egyptian papers was used in the translation of the Book of Abraham. All of these materials come afterwards and are substantially dependent on a pre-existing text of the book. The evidence also strongly suggests that the text of the Book of Abraham must have been translated by Joseph Smith in the same way he had produced the text of the Book of Mormon, the Book of Moses, and the translated parchment of John known as Doctrine and Covenants, Section 7, by revelation. There is no evidence that he attempted any sort of what we would term an academic translation of Egyptian papyri. The textual evidence simply will not support such a thesis. The purpose of the alphabet and grammar materials was extraneous to the papyri. The essential element of understanding, then, is that recognizing the dependent relationship of the alphabet and grammar materials to the previously received text of the Book of Abraham is the primary key to understanding the meaning and purpose of the Kirtland Egyptian papers.